So first of all, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Steven Swartzer, and I'm the Associate Director for Academic Programs in the Center for Ethics Education at Fordham University. So just to say a little bit about the center is directed by Dr. Celia Fisher, and it was established in 1999 as an interdisciplinary cross-campus unit at Fordham. So our center draws on the university's overlapping communities of inquiry, instruction, and faith to foster moral leadership within Fordham and the communities of New York and beyond. So we have a lot of different programs, which include an interdisciplinary master's degree program in ethics and society, an advanced graduate certificate program in healthcare ethics, the HIV and Drug Abuse Prevention Research Ethics Training Institute, that's provided a significant amount of support for our talk series, and an undergraduate bioethics minor. This year, we're also really excited to be launching a new national essay competition for college seniors. So it's the Ethics and Social Justice Essay Prize competition. This year, the competition has the theme Racial Justice, Realities, and Possibilities, and the top prize is $1,000. So the deadline for this is December 1st. If you would like more information about it to pass on to your students and colleagues, please do reach out to me, and you can reply to the Zoom invitation email to do so. So the Ethics Center embodies Fordham's commitment to intellectual excellence, social justice, and human dignity through the promotion of ethics education, research and public dialogue on issues of contemporary social import. And this brings us to today's conversation. So before I introduce the moderator for today's talk, I wanted to say a little bit about the procedure for this session. So we are really excited about the turnout for tonight, and that this new online format has enabled us to broaden the reach of some of our programming. And we really do want you to be part of the conversation. And so we welcome and encourage comments and questions from the audience. Now, in order to do so, we'll be using the chat feature for the session. So you will be able to use the chat feature to send a private chat to the moderator, Selin, and then she will be able to take care of your question from there. So with that, I would like to introduce the moderator for this evening's session. Selin Gulgoz is an assistant professor of psychology at Fordham University. Her research interests lie in children's social cognition and conceptual development, with a particular focus on children's reasoning about individuals and social groups. So Dr. Gulgoz's work examines how children with diverse and often marginalized identities construct social categories, and how children's reasoning about categories is reflected in their attitudes and behaviors toward members of those categories. So her recent work has focused on, among other things, gender cognition and transgender, gender nonconforming, and cisgender children, with a focus on gender essentialism, gender identity development, and gender-based prejudice. Her recent work also examines children's understanding of social status hierarchies between individuals and between groups. And with that, I will let Selin take it away.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this important session today. I have the honor of presenting our two speakers. Faith Fletcher is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama at the Birmingham School of Public Health in the Department of Health Behavior. Dr. Fletcher's research program is aimed at developing and implementing community and clinic-based social and behavioral research to reduce HIV-related disparities among African American women. Dr. Fletcher also conducts empirical research ethics studies to examine and address health disparities among HIV-positive women with respect to the ethics of research participation in order to develop ethical policies and strategies to alleviate vulnerability to HIV-related stigma associated with healthcare setting and research study engagement. For her commitment to health disparities and social justice, Dr. Fletcher was a 2017 recipient of the National Minority Quality Forum's 40 Under 40 Leaders in Minority Health Award. And Jonathon Rendina is an assistant professor of psychology at Hunter College and the director of the Applied Intersectionality and Minority Stress Lab, and is on the doctoral faculty of the Health, Psychology, and Clinical Science PhD program at the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Rendina's research primarily consists of studies focused on understanding the role of social stress in health from a biopsychosocial perspective, both within New York City and throughout the United States. In particular, his work focuses on the role of intersectional sexual minority stress in driving health disparities for sexual and gender minority populations and the impact of stigma on the health of people living with HIV. Doctors Fletcher and Rendina were both fellows in Fordham's HIV Drug Abuse Research Ethics Training Institute, which is led by Dr. Celia Fisher. And we feel very fortunate to have them here with us today in our discussion on promoting social justice in academia.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for having us. So I will start off the session and then I will hand it over to Faith to lead the second half of the presentation portion. I just wanted to start off with an acknowledgement that, this idea came out of a presentation that Faith and I gave as part of the Research Ethics Training Institute over the course of the summer that was really focused on issues among particularly early career faculty. And we were asked to come and present some similar work here today. I just wanted to acknowledge that this is not my area of research or my area of expertise, but I am happy to join Faith and the rest of you to have a conversation around these areas. So I'll be raising some issues that I think are important to acknowledge and be aware of within academia. But again, they're not reflective of my own personal experiences or my own areas of expertise. They're more just areas that I think we can have a fruitful discussion about and that I think are important. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Okay. So we'll be talking today about promoting social justice in academic institutions. And I wanted to start by raising the Black and the Ivory Twitter series that has been going on for several months now, where folks across the world really have commented on their experiences being Black within the ivory tower or within academia. So I just wanted to take a minute to have people read some of these experiences. Maybe many of you have already seen this Twitter phenomenon and have seen maybe even these particular posts, but I just want to pause maybe for a minute and have people read these varied experiences that people have generously shared with the world through their Twitter posts. So this is just a small sampling of the Black and the Ivory hashtag on Twitter. And so I encourage people to go and check it out if you haven't already. And this is just a small subsection of the experiences that people have had in academic settings as Black and other people of color. And so I think it's important that we start the discussion by just acknowledging this range of experiences that can be difficult and uncomfortable to hear about and learn about, but that are super important to raise awareness about and to amplify the voices of these people who were, again, generous enough to share these experiences with people. The next slide is a series of suggestions that I also think are a really great way to start the presentation for, in particular, white academics, but really anyone who is not a Black academic, about ways that you can support Black students in academics. And I will just maybe quickly read these ones aloud. So the first one is to stand up for Black voices in the moment, especially when they're pushing back against a norm. Emailing or approaching after the fact, saying, I really appreciate what you said or how you called X, Y, or Z out isn't helpful. Silent agreement doesn't change culture. Introduce them to your network at your institution, at conferences, at places they express interest in possibly working. Having mentors organically say, hey, let me introduce you to my colleague without having to ask has opened so many doors. Invite them to collaborate for authorship. Example of this for me, could I adapt your code for something similar you did and have you on as an author? Or I know you did a lit review, have knowledge on this topic and could contribute to the intro and discussion sections. Invite them to speak about their work in guest lectures and seminars, on panels. If you have a role coordinating any sort of speaker series, do an audit of who you have historically asked. Many of us may not have completed our degrees yet, but we are experts too. Really reflect on patterns in any hiring or admissions roles that you have. Much of the weeding out may not be overt. Are applicants from all types of institutions being considered equally? And compensate folks for the time that they spend on DEI initiatives for your department or institution. CV lines from the activity itself do not count as currency. So again, I think it's really helpful that these are suggestions, but in these suggestions, you can also see many of the different issues and problems being raised. So I wanted to just start with that before I go into really two major topics that I think are sort of big and obvious ways that anti-Black racism and white supremacy make their way into academia and that we could all collectively work to address and to change. So the first one of these is racial bias in academia via standardized testing. And so I'm sure many of you have recently completed the GREs and many of you may already be aware of this phenomenon, but I think this is a really critical phenomenon that we all maintain critical consciousness about, which is the issue of standardized tests like the GRE or the LSAT, and the ways that they really undermine equity and inclusion within academic settings. And they do so for a range of reasons. And the three sort of most well-discussed and publicized reasons are that the tests themselves, and in particular, the preparation that many people often go through to do better on these tests, are highly cost prohibitive. And so this poses a significant financial barrier before someone who might be interested in pursuing graduate study can even submit an application for graduate study and be considered for graduate study. And although they are considered to be tests of more innate abilities, there is a substantial market for the prep materials and tutoring that come along with these that allow people with means and resources to enhance their own seeming innate ability while leaving others with less preparation. In addition to that, the test scores themselves are actually designed to be predictive, objective indicators of who will succeed in graduate school, but have been shown to have very poor predictive validity when it comes to graduate performance in particular, and that other metrics like undergraduate grades outperform these types of tests. And also finally, that the GRE in particular has a well-documented and an inherent gender and racial or ethnic bias. And you can see that really over on the chart on the left-hand side, where you have columns representing the GRE verbal and GRE quantitative scores, and a range of different groups broken down on the left-hand side. And this information is all coming from the beyondthegre.org website. So this is taken directly from research that they have pulled together. And so this was one study where they documented differences at the intersection of gender and race ethnicity. And what you can see are pretty substantial differences among these groups, where individuals who are white or Asian and men versus women perform substantially better on both sections of the GRE than all of the other groups. And so that documents some of the inherent gender and racial or ethnic bias. And I will say that ETS, who develops and utilizes the GRE, actually recommends that it not be developed with regard to cut points, and that it be part of more holistic approach to evaluating applicants. However, I think probably many of us are aware that GRE scores have become one of the earliest criteria that people look at to start whittling down the very large lists of applicants that we often have for graduate programs these days. And so even though they are not recommended to be used in that way, that is exactly the way that they often end up being used, is as sort of a gateway to get into the next step of consideration where an applicant can be looked at more holistically. And so that is one of the major issues, and one of the reasons that a lot of prominent programs were already working to remove GRE requirements from their graduate program application processes, which has actually been heightened. One of the few maybe benefits of the COVID epidemic, that more and more programs actually moved to make them optional as a result of COVID, because fewer and fewer people had access to the testing over the past year. And so it has lit a little bit of a fire under this initiative, which I think can actually have meaningful and important impacts for helping in a small way to reduce gender and racial and ethnic bias in academia. The next issue that I want to talk about is about NIH funding, which for those of us who do health-focused work, which I think many of us here do, is a critical way that people build their careers within academia. And so many of you may have heard about the recent study that was published in Science that sought to look at bias within NIH funding. And what they were particularly interested in looking at was why Black relative to white scientists had substantially lower rates of funding. And the study investigated a range of factors and found that 3 of the 6 factors that they investigated within a model that was adjusted for all of the other factors were the biggest contributors to the gap. And I'll talk a little bit more about these on the slides that come, but those 3 factors were application discussion, so whether or not an application that was submitted made it past the first hurdle and got discussed by the reviewers in the in-person or virtual reviews that happen. Impact score, which is then the score that gets assigned when it does get discussed. And finally, topic choice. I will also briefly mention that there were other noteworthy factors that included things like institutional characteristics. So whether folks were coming from really well-resourced Ivy League institutions that put a lot of startup funds into new faculty so that they had pilot data to compete for these types of awards, or whether they were coming from organizations that are predominantly minority serving or historically Black colleges and universities. And another one was career stage. So early career folks are obviously less likely to have a history of NIH funding compared to mid or senior stage folks. And it's really important to note that because of bias in academia, among Black and other people of color who are in academia, many more of them are early career because there were so few who were represented in the ranks of academia in prior decades. But this is going to go into the specifics that I wanted to just really briefly discuss. I'm not sure how many people in the room are aware of the NIH funding process, and so I just want to briefly outline that once someone submits an application to NIH for funding, there are a few stages through which that application goes. The first stage is that the application is assigned to usually about 3, sometimes up to 5 reviewers, and those individuals will each independently review the application and assign it a preliminary score. Then the review group as a whole comes together and has a whole kind of pot of applications that they are all reviewing together. And about the top half of those applications will be discussed in that meeting, and the bottom half of the applications will be considered not discussed and won't be scored further. And so the researcher will never receive a final score, but they will receive some of the preliminary scores that they got from those 3 assigned reviewers, as well as some written feedback from those reviewers. Once an application is actually in that top half and gets discussed, then all 3 of the reviewers will present their views on the application, and then every other reviewer, most of whom didn't read the application in advance, will all be invited to score the application and the average of those reviewers' scores is assigned as the application's impact score. And then from the impact score, most applications are normally given a percentile, similar to how GRE scores are percentiled. And then they go to various NIH institutes like the National Institute on Drug Abuse or the National Institute on Mental Health, who make the ultimate decision on which applications to fund, usually in order of priority score and percentile, but not 100% based on those features. So having said that, one of the most striking things that I think you can see here is the arrow all the way to the far left, which is the number of applicants. And so you can see that they studied applications from 948 African-American or Black applicants compared to 34,218 white applicants. So obviously the number of submissions is already a major disparity. From there, what you can see in the middle, in between the red and the blue, those percentages are the ratio of Black applicants to white applicants. And so what that means is, for example, that Black applicants are submitting 84% or 16% fewer applications than white applicants. So they're submitting 84% the number of applications. From there, there's a major disparity in whether or not they get discussed. So the 3 reviewers assign them preliminary scores, and for Black or African-American applicants, 25% fewer of them get a preliminary score that is in the top 50% that end up getting discussed in the review group. And then from there, when you take out discussion as a factor and you have applicants that all got scored, 79% of Black applicants get a fundable score compared to white applicants. And so you can see that there are really disparities that emerge at all stages of the process, from whether or not a person ever submits an application to whether or not that application is given an initial preliminary score that is deemed of high enough quality to discuss. And from there, even among those that are all deemed to be high enough quality to discuss, whether or not they get a fundable score and are recommended for funding and ultimately receive the grant. And one of the reasons that was really novel about this publication that they looked into was the issue of quote unquote topic choice. And so topic choice has to do with the various areas that people can apply to NIH to study. So the areas in which you could propose a new study. And NIH has, I forget the current number, but it's somewhere between like 20 and 26 institutes and centers that do funding, and they all have their own sort of areas of expertise, like mental health or drug abuse or cancer. And among those, they all also fund really common things. And what you can see in these word charts is on the left, in the sort of circle that's represented with the letter A, are the topics that Black or African American scientists are most likely to pursue. And on the right, with the word clouds labeled with B, are the topics that Black or African American applicants are the least likely to submit to study. What you can then see is that Black or African American applicants are much more likely to be studying issues that have to do with health disparities and health equity. So they are looking at things like HIV, they're looking at things like physical activity and obesity, they're looking at things like risk, patient-oriented outcomes, women and population health, so this is really, I think, important, because on the right-hand side, what you see are a lot of really basic topics that don't really have much of a health disparity or health equity focus to them. Cartilage, neurons, corneal, iron, prion, skin. So these are really kind of basic science, basic medicine studies. And what we see in the data is that Black and African American applicants are less likely to be drawn to those areas and much more likely to be drawn to these applied intervention and health equity focused topics. Then the really important thing that jumps out here is actually the percentages that's associated with each of those word clouds. And those are the funding rates for each of those different topic areas. And what you can see is that in general, although the percentages are not massively different, we're not looking at like 10 versus 30%, predominantly all of the topic areas that Black and African American applicants are most likely to pursue have lower rates of funding than the more basic areas that Black and African American scientists are least likely to pursue. So this, I think, is a really important, and it was a really novel finding at the time that showed, that it wasn't all just focused on sort of the review process, which is a really critical piece of the process, but also that, sort of where NIH is putting its money and where ultimately Congress dictates where NIH is able to put its money. So where Congress is sort of allocating the money is one of the origins of inequities and disparities in funding rates between Black and other scientists. And that Black and other people of color who are scientists are more likely to be studying these health equity and applied areas. But it's really these more basic areas that they're least likely to be involved in that are receiving the much higher rates of funding from both Congress and ultimately from NIH. So that was all I wanted to raise in terms of, given the time, in terms of some major issues that lead to inequities in academia. I did also then just want to take a minute to talk about resources. And for me, one of the most amazing resources that has come about recently has been the Academics for Black Survival and Wellness Initiative, which is a website and a series of trainings that have come about over the past few months by some academics in Florida. And they offer ongoing trainings for non-Black academics around anti-Black racism, white supremacy, decolonizing the academy, and promoting Black liberation. And for Black academics, they actually have substantial content that is geared towards healing, self-care, and activism. So if you haven't heard of this, and if you haven't been to this website, I really strongly encourage it. They initially did a really sort of intensive 7-day training that you had to register for. And then in the month of August, they opened up that content for a sort of 21-day self-paced opportunity. Right now, I don't believe that there's any of the main training content. All of the content geared towards Black academics is still there, but the training focused content is currently not there as far as I understand. The last time I checked, which was yesterday, they had taken down most of that content, but it seems like they are gearing up for kind of another round of trainings. And so I would really strongly recommend that people stay tuned and follow them on Twitter or Instagram and keep visiting their website. They also have a lot of really great resources that are both training oriented, but also areas where you could direct funding or petitions that you can sign to help join in the fight for Black liberation and against anti-Black racism. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Faith. So I will stop sharing my screen.
So thank you, Jonathan, for raising those important issues. And I'd like to reiterate that I'm happy to be here today to talk about promoting equity in academic environments, social justice, as well as equity. So in the next part of this presentation, I'll talk about some of the lived experiences that Jonathan also raised through Black in the Ivory. Specifically, I'll draw on some of my experiences as well as recommend strategies for individuals who are in positions of power and leadership positions to really serve as allies and mentors and sponsors to faculty generally, especially faculty of color. And I will use minority faculty and faculty of color interchangeably. I would like to highlight that it's especially important to center the experiences of Black individuals in academic institutions. All experiences are important, but it's especially important to think about anti-Black racism, which we are definitely grappling with right now in the United States. So this is an important point of consideration and discussion. Again, Black in the Ivory really presents a nice way to think about these issues from these different perspectives. So we know that recent events, COVID-19, as well as state-sanctioned violence against Blacks or African Americans in the United States, has really raised important discussions within academic institutions for addressing structural racism. And again, this has yielded multiple conversations, this dialogue surrounding really understanding the experiences of faculty of color or minority faculty to promote equity in different environments. So I wanted to start off by talking about the minority tax. It's something we hear about a lot as it relates to academic environments, but I would just like to give a general overview. When we speak of the minority tax in academic environments, we're referring to the burden of extra responsibilities placed on minority faculty to achieve diversity. So again, this is especially salient right now as institutions develop strategies and are really under pressure to promote equity amongst all faculty, especially faculty of color during this time. There's additional taxes and burdens that minority faculty experience. So URMs may be disproportionately charged to lead institutional diversity initiatives. These commitments, as highlighted in this article, I have the citation below, rarely comes with additional resources, compensation. Sometimes it limits time to focus on individual scholarship, which I'll talk a little bit about as I progress through this presentation. URMs frequently feel responsible to serve as mentors for URM learners and junior faculty without having adequate mentorship for themselves. So a common experience is that minority faculty are sometimes expected to take on and mentor all the minority faculty in the department. So just imagine having 2 minority faculty, which is sometimes not even the case. And students sometimes will gravitate towards this minority faculty member because of experiences as well as maybe research and teaching similarities. So again, this presents additional burdens for these faculty. And again, we must address these things by thinking about our hiring practices internally. URMs may experience professional isolation in that there are few individuals in their institutions who look like them. This leads to a lot of establishing of informal networks, and I'll talk about how minority faculty, in particular, women of color, have established these networks to support one another, especially during times of crises and during challenging, stressful times throughout the life course as a person in the academy. And then one thing that's frequently reported, and we see this a lot now, is that URMs may suffer discrimination from patients, as clinicians, or as colleagues, and feel primary ownership of addressing racism within their own institutions. So this is pretty much the landscape. So when I'm referring to the minority tax, these are some areas that I'm referring to. So this tax can essentially lead to labels and stereotypes. And I was actually having conversations with some women of color earlier, and I was like, what are some, commonly used terms to describe minority faculty? And overextended was something that immediately emerged. Overwhelmed. Minority faculty are overwhelmed. They're not good with meeting deadlines. They generally need extensions. Just too busy to take on anything else, especially new opportunities that could even be valuable to their careers. They're not focused enough. They're focused on lots of different research areas. They're spread too thin, and they are also incompetent in some ways. So when I think about, again, the minority tax and these additional burdens that are imposed on minority faculty because of structural racism and institutional deficiencies, this is generally imposed in terms of labels and stereotypes upon minority faculty. So again, we need to be careful when we start thinking about people being overextended. What are things that you can do within your institution to alleviate these burdens? Sometimes there's opportunities to remove minority faculty from certain committees. When there's diversity opportunities for leading COVID-19 task force, minority faculty, especially junior faculty, may not be the best people to lead these initiatives. So again, we constantly need to evaluate our practices and make sure that this aligns with anti-racism praxis. So the reality is, I hear this a lot, put on your own oxygen mask before you assist others. This is not always possible or achievable for many faculty. And a few things that I wanted to highlight is that the literature reports that minority faculty are very communal, and this has also been reported for women, so I'd like to highlight that as well, very much team focused. So individual scholarship is not always prioritized. So we hear this a lot, that by the end of the day, when you think about, there's a lot of programs that are really promoting more structure and organization amongst faculty, and it allows faculty to really highlight areas. So which areas in your calendar or your to-do list, which areas are really focused on your individual scholarship? And you can see the disproportionate burden of focused on other projects that may distract from individual scholarship. A lot of times minority faculty are really connected to the work, as Jonathon highlighted, these particular issues focused on disparities and inequities, HIV, understanding things about racial segregation amongst communities of color, diabetes. So sometimes it's really hard to say no when you're personally affected or have family members who are affected by these health inequities. This is generally why many minority faculty come into these areas of social justice, because of experiences, because of socialization. So again, balancing, saying no to certain things can become very challenging. Minority faculty sometimes feel the responsibility to nurture other students of color, because sometimes we feel like if we don't provide that mentorship, then based on our experiences as graduate students, we're very committed to changing the dynamic and providing more mentorship than we may have possibly received. And additionally, we like to elevate others in our work, and sometimes it's harder to promote and market our own work. And in the next part of the presentation, I'll talk about people who've been able to do this really well and have promoted my work over the years, and it's been really helpful and instrumental for advancing my career. So these are some realities. So this notion that mentorship is not sufficient and that we have to really expand this conversation and our praxis into sponsorship. So sponsorship is defined as active support by someone appropriately placed in an organization who has significant influence on decision-making processes or structures, and who's skilled in advocating, protecting, and fighting for the career advancement of an individual. So that recent articles have emerged in how sponsorship can be applied in academic institutions. Sponsors exert more direct influence compared to mentors. They work beyond a transactional relationship. It requires senior leaders to risk their reputation. So you hear that a lot, that sometimes they're not people who can adequately mentor because they're concerned about their personal reputation. But sponsors personally invest their time to promote what they view as future leaders or protégés in the field. Sponsorship has always existed, but the luxury of sponsorship has not always been extended to faculty of color, students of color. And again, this really has become part of the conversation as we think about promoting and ensuring diversity at the highest level, especially during this time. And again, here's a citation as we think about saving these references and having further conversations. So I want to highlight, based on my own lived experiences in the academy over the past 10 years or so, some examples of sponsorship include leveraging networks, power, and positionality, extending opportunities to URM faculty, promoting the work and expertise, inviting people to take part in co-authored projects, to lead projects, to co-author manuscripts, as Jonathon mentioned, invited lectures and conference presentations, and finally cite Black women. But here I highlight two instances. The first one, a recent citation that I had in the Rolling Stone, and actually this existed because of a connection that I had through Dr. Celia Fisher. And I can honestly say, before I tweeted, which I'm just new to the Twitter world, I got on Twitter really at the beginning of the pandemic because I needed to be connected with people. Before I could even tweet this, Celia Fisher had already reached out to her staff to post this in a blog through Fordham University. And when I saw that, I just really appreciated the fact that she was very intentional and rapid in doing this, because we know that information, that's important to address this and circulate information pretty rapidly, and Celia had already done that. So again, this can serve as, it served as an email that I was able to send to my chair and send to my dean to promote my work. And it also took some of the responsibility off of me as a woman and a woman of color, sometimes, again, it's challenging to really promote and market our own work. So again, having sponsors like Celia, and this can really serve as a strong example for other people who want to serve as allies and sponsors. Another example, and again, this is, I would say, very instrumental to my career. In 2018, Celia was invited to NIMHD to talk about ethics as it relates to HIV and health and equities. And she invited 3 Black women who were a part of the Research Ethics Training Institute. We were all a part of different cohorts, but we had alignment as it relates to our research. So it was a very nice presentation. We were able to engage in dialogue. We were able to meet people at the National Institute for Minority Health Disparities. And again, it provided that visibility, and it provided a citation and a reference that we're able to share at our institution. So when we think about being recognized nationally, sometimes the networks are not as expanded for minority faculty. So this, again, provided an excellent example of how Celia was able to facilitate that and use her leadership and her positionality to do that for 3 faculty of color. So I highlighted the importance of Cite Black Women. We know that there are metrics that are important to academic promotion and tenure related to citing. And again, sometimes we look within our networks. So there are intentional strategies and movements as it relates to citing Black women, citing other faculty of color. And this particular movement is led by Kristen Smith, who's a Black feminist anthropologist at the University of Texas at Austin. And in her work, she really highlights the importance of reading Black women's work, integrating Black women into the core of your syllabus. So sometimes we PDF articles and we provide those articles to our students. Another strategy might be just to provide the reference, because again, that helps with citation metrics. I frequently do that in my health and equities course with my students. I'm very intentional about talking about who authors are, what's their lens, why are we reading this? Again, sometimes we know about more traditional folks who are social justice advocates or experts in public health. So it's really important to expand these networks and expand who we think of as experts and who we go to as experts. It's important to acknowledge Black women's intellectual production, to make space for Black women to speak. So at many conferences, I'll highlight that there are conferences that are being very intentional as it relates to when there are presentations, who are we going to allow to be at the forefront to begin the conversation, to ask the questions, because we know that there are voices and critical voices that are not always included in the conversation, that are not always at the forefront and front facing. So again, this is a change and a shift in the way that we generally do things, because we know that there are certain individuals who are less likely to ask questions. So we want to provide the space for that to happen. So I highlight another example of sponsorship. I am fortunate. I have many sponsors and mentors that have been instrumental to advancing my career, but I highlight Vince Bonham because he is an associate investigator at the National Human Genome Research Institute and has been my mentor for over 15 years. And again, I started off, and I'm saying this because I know some of you are at the beginning of your careers and don't ever feel like you reach out to as many people as you can. What I found is, especially early on in your career as a student, people are more likely to respond to you. They're more likely to provide assistance to you. So really take advantage of those opportunities early on. And Vince was one of those people. I felt completely intimidated early on when I was applying for internships. I was like, I can't go to the NIH. Like, I'm from Louisiana. I've never really lived on the East Coast, but he really just held my hand throughout the process and provided me with opportunities to collaborate with him on studies, genetics research, health equity studies. He continues to invite me for presentations and lectures. It's really important when we think about the pipeline. In some areas, in some fields, it's not even necessarily, it doesn't even exist. So we have to figure out what are some better strategies, what are some things that we can do institutional wise. There are R25s that are really important. We need to really focus on writing R25s, focused on health inequities and health disparities, similar to the Research Ethics Training Institute. This idea of intergenerational mentorship is key. So we need to think about who are you training and who do you expect them to train as we're establishing more health equity and health disparities researchers and more people focused. So again, being very intentional about that and thinking about how can we promote and support these informal mentorship networks that exist across the academy, especially with minority faculty. And finally, I'll highlight when we think about sponsorship as being personally invested, and Vince is definitely one of those people. Again, I remember being completely concerned and afraid to ride the metro as a person who was from a small city in Louisiana. And Vince, one day he took a few hours and he's like, I'm going to take you out. I'm going to ride the metro with you. And I never forgot that. And I think as mentors, we have to be open to riding the metro with our students and really building them up and serving as a source of empowerment for them. So some of the takeaways include, we need to understand what privilege is and what it's not. So white privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It means that your skin color isn't one of the things that makes it harder. So again, as we're thinking about issues that are germane to Black people and people of color, we need to center this and keep this at the forefront. It's important to think about leveraging power, privilege networks to promote equity in the academy. We should not avoid difficult conversations. On the contrast, we need to create space to have these conversations. There are many informal grassroots programs that many administrators and leaders are unaware of within institutions. It takes some probing, it takes some conversations with faculty of color. At my institution a few years ago, we established a Women of Color writing group, and we meet weekly. We support one another. It really has provided space and encouragement to just really tell folks or ask like, hey, what are you working on related to your individual scholarship? How are your manuscripts going? How are your grants going? So again, these networks are there. Leaders and administrators should find ways to support and not to intrude, because we need the safe space, but there should also be resources that really help to elevate and further establish these groups. So think about what's being done at other institutions. Sometimes you hear department chairs and other folks saying that they don't really know what to do. And again, it requires research, some examination of what's happening. There are some institutions who are doing this very well, and we want to learn from them. So more frequently, we're hearing a lot about people who are seeking excessive help externally about structural racism, to have conversations with faculty and administrators related to structural racism and health inequities. And this is key. It's important to draw on resources, external resources. Sometimes we need people who are external to really delve into the issues that are happening internally. Lots of focus groups happening across the nation with students of color and faculty of color to really understand what some of the challenges and the pitfalls are. But again, when we realize that we don't have the expertise in-house, it should really prompt examination of hiring practices and what diversity looks like internally. So another question is, how are your institutions and policies advantaging and disadvantaging faculty and students of color? Are you contributing to the minority taxed? Are you working to mitigate the minority taxed? So here's a common statement that happens during hiring at academic institutions and generally. Faculty of color, we know this, evidence suggests that faculty of color are overburdened by teaching, service, and mentoring. As a person at a Research One institution, sometimes the question emerges, how will you balance these things? So the question should be, how are institutions addressing this to alleviate some of these challenges and barriers and burdens for faculty of color? So we definitely need to think about the way that we're framing our questions, and we need to avoid imposing individual level responsibility on faculty of color, especially as we navigate these issues. Can you lead a meeting on racial reconciliation? Can you serve on the diversity committee? Can you head the COVID-19 Disparities Task Force? Many people feel like they're not positioned to have conversations about race and racism. And again, this should not fall on minority faculty to persistently lead these conversations. And finally, I just want to highlight that we all have a role in the anti-racism fight. So as a person of color or as a white person, as a person who's disadvantaged, a person who's advantaged, we all need to work together because we have specific roles that we can really fulfill at this time to address these issues and promote equity within academic institutions. And similar to Jonathon, I've provided some resources. The first document is an anti-racism resource. There's a Google Doc available, wonderful books that are highlighted. There are some institutions right now that are reading White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. This is a very great text and resource. So you want to talk about race as another. So there are many podcasts and websites included in this resource. So I encourage you to examine this. Another resource that I'm involved in right now is COVID Black. It was established at the beginning of the pandemic. It's a digital humanities collective. And this organization has really sought to develop strategies and tools electronically to, again, promote health and equity and raise awareness about health disparities within Black communities. Definitely focused on anti-Black racism. So I leave that here for you as well as you're, again, navigating the pandemic. Black ladies in public health. I surveyed some women earlier to ask them about some of the labels that are sometimes imposed on Black faculty, especially Black female faculty. And this is an excellent resource as well. Women, it's another community, but it's also a place if as an administrator you have an interest in reaching out or providing resources or job announcements, this is a place that you can do it. And Dr. Jasmine Ward is the leader and CEO of Black Ladies in Public Health, and over 14,000 members. And finally, the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity is a wonderful resource, again, for leaders and administrators. There's resources for students. It's an on-demand access to mentoring tools and support that provide strategies for faculty generally to be successful in the academy. And this might include writing 30 minutes every day. Sometimes people think that we can't find 30 minutes, but evidence suggests that even that can be important and assist in advancing writing goals. So there is an institutional subscription. There's a lot of folks right now that are really promoting this. And I think it's important as we think about the interruption that we've all experienced during this pandemic and during this time. So I'll leave you with a few discussion questions and reflections. What are some ways that you might contribute to equity and inclusion? And what are the barriers and concerns that you may encounter advancing this work at multiple levels, at the individual, interpersonal level, at the academic institution level? Jonathon, I talked about this from a research perspective. We know that there are many large-scale cohort studies that provide many opportunities for publishing and really providing pilot data for larger R1 grants. And it's important that we think about who's at the table, who's not at the table as it relates to leading these studies as well as participating in these studies. There are opportunities for students to become involved in this research, diversity supplements, which can really help to launch a graduate student's career if someone's interested in a research trajectory. So again, we want to be sensitive and mindful and really aware of these resources so that we can educate students and really, again, help to advance their careers. So what are some examples of strong mentorship, allyship, sponsorship that you have witnessed? And finally, what approaches are you taking to become a better mentor, ally, and sponsor? Again, thank you for having us here to present some of these issues. Again, we're here to raise more questions than to provide answers. And I will stop my screen share right now.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Rendina, for such a compelling presentation on promoting diversity and social justice in academia. I particularly really found that it was so made so much more powerful with the personal narratives, both from Dr. Fletcher's experiences and of academics who have contributed to the Black and the Ivory discussion online. And I'm sure others in the audience would agree that this was a very informative and enlightening talk in terms of how white individuals in these academic institutions can start to promote anti-racism in their environment. So fueled by the types of narratives that you've illustrated and shown in your talk, in the last month, psychologists and social scientists have been debating how to reckon with the racist roots of psychology as a field of scientific study. And arguably, racism is not only in the roots of psychology, but also very much in its present. So in these debates, which like Black and the Ivory, have been primarily happening on Twitter or through blog posts by people like Andrew Gelman, one specific focus has been on prominent names in the field of statistics like Fisher, Pearson, Galton, and others who are known to not only be racist themselves, but also to have created and promoted racist pseudoscientific practices like eugenics. And these are people who have strongly contributed to contemporary racist practices. And they're also people whose methods, like correlations and analyses of variance, that we as psychologists use on a daily basis. So in one of these recent opinion pieces, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin, Moin Syed, talked about how, so this was in relation to this debate specifically about whether as psychologists we should consider renaming a prize that's named after Fisher, who is again one of these people who had very racist opinions, but also, is the person who brought us the analysis of variance, whether we should rename this prize in an effort to remedy psychology's historical contributions to racism. And Dr. Syed pointed out that while some might inevitably argue that it's important to separate the man from his work, because this is an argument that we constantly see in these sorts of discussions, it seems impossible to do that when the impacts of racist practices are felt in daily practice as scientists, as Dr. Fletcher and Rendina have demonstrated. In addition, I think what has been really powerful in Dr. Fletcher and Rendina's talk is demonstrating how this is not just specific to psychology, but that it's deeply ingrained in how we conduct academics. So as they've pointed out, the use of GREs and other standardized tests for admissions to higher education and graduate programs have served to limit the participation of Black and other marginalized groups in academic and scientific spheres, which means that since the very beginning of our practice and still today, fields like psychology have been asking questions that predominantly white men have been interested in. And they've asked these questions to other predominantly white men and have assessed their findings using measures that are standardized with predominantly white male populations and so on. So what we're finding is that even when researchers of color have managed to break through these very strong and deeply rooted barriers in academia, the white male majority of scholars means that further barriers against researchers of colors are put in place at various steps of or various levels of academic institutions. So one example comes from a study that was published in Perspectives of Psych Science last month by Dr. Stephen Roberts and his colleagues, which demonstrated this phenomenon by showing that among 26,000 articles that they published between 1974, I believe, and 2018 in top psychology journals, they found that the greater the proportion of white editorial board members of a journal was, the lower the proportion of publications that highlighted race were published, or the lower the proportion of publications by scientists of color were featured in those journals. So barriers to becoming successful in academia are multifaceted. And these barriers also affect intersectional identities and intersectional identities differently. So when we talk about barriers to becoming successful, these are particularly pronounced for Black or Indigenous women of color. So for example, in a 2010 paper, Ryu showed that while Black and Indigenous women of color constituted about 10% of academics at the instructor, lecturer, assistant professor levels, this number dropped to 7% at the associate level and 3% at the full professor level. And as Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Rendina's talks have demonstrated, one reason that they argued for this has been the fact that small numbers of Black and Indigenous women of color in the academic settings means that these academics are overburdened with service tasks born from this sort of being perceived as a token member of their group. So these and many other examples provide evidence for the urgency of promoting diversity and social justice in psychology as well as in academia more broadly. So moving into some of the questions that might extend our discussion further, one of the things that we've been thinking about is how these issues are becoming more pronounced during a pandemic like COVID. So COVID has pushed a large proportion of academics to work from home. There's been growing news coverage and research investigating the unfair burden on women academics, for example, who are now having to take on more duties at home like childcare or homeschooling, while also trying to maintain a full-time research and teaching program. And to be honest, I am one of those women. But even though we might have needed something like COVID to really highlight gender gaps in career advancement opportunities, due to these sorts of stereotypical household responsibilities, these gaps are actually not new and have always presented barriers for people, and particularly women of color. So I would like to extend this discussion by first asking to what extent our speakers might think that this broader academic culture surrounding productivity and the ideals of who is cut out to be an academic or who has the ability to sacrifice enough to become a true academic, quote unquote, how these ideals reinforce barriers that women and people of color face in terms of entering and then staying successful within academia.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I think I kind of just want to go back to something early on. You know, we've been hearing a lot about the trauma that people have experienced during the pandemic. Just generally, many people are caring for, and something that I've seen a lot lately with some of my minority colleagues, they're caring for parents and grandparents during this time. So I think a lot of the dialogue has been about caring for children, but many people live in multi-generational households, even academics. So I think thinking about, again, understanding more about these lived experiences that are germane, this has just added an additional layer, an additional challenge right now during the pandemic. And one thing that I didn't mention earlier is that, again, the literature, we're seeing more and more about the experiences. So if you look at the trajectory of academics of color compared to other academics over a lifetime, there are places of lost productivity as it relates, again, caring for parents, grandparents, death, economic challenges, trauma. I know at some point in my career, I experienced some trauma, and there's not a lot of resources in order to be able to really navigate through that. And I think what I really found to be most valuable to me were people like Celia and people like Vince, who were like, hey, this year, we recognize you might not publish one paper, but I'm inviting you to co-author a paper this year or work on a grant, which again, really helps with motivation. And so I think we have to, again, be very thoughtful and kind to people. Instead of judging folks according to their metrics, these people literally have a personal investment in my well-being. And so again, I can just say that we have to continue to model that type of behavior in the academy, showing people grace, showing them kindness, and recognizing that there are periods of time where productivity and work and focus is just not possible. So I think having more people as leaders who have had these experiences who are empathetic to this can really help us as a community, as an academic community.
I think I would just add that there's a great resource called Dismantling Racism, a Workbook for Social Change Groups by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. And they talk about the different characteristics of white supremacy culture. And one of those is perfectionism. So I'm sure many of us grew up learning perfectionism as sort of a goal. And I think that's definitely a goal within academia. And I think it has been one of the main ways that gatekeepers can sort of flip privilege into sort of like an ideal that helps to keep some people out and keep other people moving up in terms of power and privilege. And so I think that is absolutely sort of one of the underlying issues within our field is, the notion that, in graduate school, you should have no life and everything should be focused on this one thing. And you should, be publishing more papers than everybody, and, all of these different sort of ideals that I think feel very natural to many of us. And for a long time, were never questioned, that really are rightfully being pointed out as being sort of ideal mechanisms through which supremacy is able to operate without question, basically. And so that's what your question sort of made me think about is some of those different characteristics of white supremacy culture that if people haven't seen that work, I would really recommend, because it is very eye-opening to learn that, some of the things that you have taken for granted and worked towards your whole life are actually really mechanisms of white supremacy.
Would you be able to maybe write the name of the authors and the resource to me, and I can share it with the whole group? Since I've been getting a lot of questions about having access to the resources that are being shared. So great, thank you. Oh, you were able to just send it to anyone. Okay. All right. So I'll start bringing in some of I have a few of my own questions as well, but I'll start bringing in some of the audience questions because I think some are relevant right now. So Matthew asked, again, to both of our speakers, whether you believe that online learning, especially in a pandemic like right now, will further polarize Black and POC students, learners, researchers. So what would be the appropriate steps that you think different academic institutions should take to especially prevent these groups becoming further disadvantaged in a situation like this?
Yeah, I mean, so I would reiterate that this is not like my area of expertise. I'm happy to share an opinion, but I would also be interested in what other people in the room think about this. But, at Hunter College, we are a predominantly minority serving institution. And I will say that one of the first things that was done was a laptop loan and tablet loan program. And more recently, an initiative to give out MiFi and Wi-Fi extending devices for people to make sure that they have access, because access, I think, is the most fundamental of the sort of issues facing people. So I think that those are important steps. I don't think that that's going to get us all the way there, but I do think, if places aren't even doing some of those fundamental things to ensure that there's equal access, then you're absolutely going to see inequities.
Yes, I agree with Jonathan. I would also be interested, especially in what some of the administrators and leaders are doing at their own institutions to promote equity during this time. But I mean, again, I think it's very important to understand students' experiences around the pandemic right now. So we think about not having access to technology, but some people have housing insecurity that, was that heightened during the pandemic, and individuals who, I heard this from several colleagues who teach at historically Black colleges and universities, when students return home because of the job instability that was imposed by the pandemic, some of them had to work. So, it was challenging to meet deadlines and to complete assignments when they were working at grocery stores from midnight to 5 a.m. in the morning. So again, these are a lot of things that we take for granted as academics, as administrators. I think the privilege, the fact that many people are in college, we forget that their experiences are very different, and there's a range of experiences across different groups of students. So again, understanding, meeting with students, finding out what some of the challenges are and how we can meet those needs, like just using a community engaged lens. We do this in our research all the time, but here we have a population that's very vulnerable right now. So we need to really apply the same tenets.
Yeah, and I would also just say, we see, I'm hopeful that it leads to a sort of shift in the practice within academia and, in teaching in particular. But I will say I'm a little concerned because I do see, among faculty colleagues of my own, that people are pushing to require students to be on video during class sessions to make sure, to sort of police students and make sure that they're engaged in the class session when, we know that people may not have private spaces to be in. We know that people may not have the bandwidth to be on video. And so, there is sort of like a lack of compassion, I would say, among at least some, that I'm hoping maybe this will lead people to sort of shift and see some of the problems in the ways that they've been doing things for decades now. But, it is also a little concerning.
Yes, and I think we have an opportunity, especially those who teach social science courses and health inequities courses, to really center the pandemic and the challenges. So I'm seeing that a lot. It's here, it exists, and from a health behavior perspective, in my courses, I'm able to do a personal health behavior assignment, thinking about how can we encourage and empower students right now to achieve a certain health behavior, a certain health goal. We're all struggling with a lack of normality, with remaining healthy during this time. So again, I think just being very intentional about our assignments and allowing students voice at the beginning of class to think about, so how was your week? What were some of the challenges that you encountered? What are some good things that happened? And that's one of the things that I think we need to do in education, from an educational perspective, to really center these experiences and to center students.
Yeah, that's a great reminder for educators. Yeah, definitely. Continuing on that same topic, in addition to the pandemic, a lot has been going on between the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, many others, protests against police violence, and then the subsequent acts of police violence, and more recent shooting of Jacob Blake, and the unrests in Kenosha, the upcoming presidential election, and on and on and on. Like every day we're waking up to new added stressors that might exacerbate the challenges that faculty and students of color might face. So going back to this conversation of productivity, how do you think one can handle right now the pressure between this wanting to be involved in the social justice movements that are going on and wanting to, be productive in academia, especially if you're a graduate student or an early career researcher? And this question is actually coming from Celia.
Again, just speaking from my experience, I think there's a balance in terms of saying yes to everything. Sometimes, again, the notion that Black faculty are being invited to speak on panels and to take part in webinars, and again, these issues are really important, but just really keeping self-care as the center, that's something that I've had to really push for over the past several months. And again, these informal networks, other women of color. I mean, if you're a graduate student, I really encourage you to make sure that you have a group of people that you can go to help you to remain accountable to whatever goals that you set. Also recognizing that your goals can change and you might not meet your goals at this time, but again, being very intentional about what you want to accomplish over the next several months. I think, that's an important piece of it. In terms of, I don't know if Celia wanted us to talk a little bit. I don't know if your question also related to research. Was that part of it? How to balance those things?
Yeah. So how to balance wanting to be part of the social movements that are happening outside of academia as well as within academia, but then, your individual career development and productivity.
Okay. Jonathon, I'm not sure if you would like to comment on the, okay.
So, I mean, I think, I can speak from the position of someone with multiple, sort of privileged positions, like from the other side of things, what I think, men and white folks, and particularly white men, can and should be doing is realizing that this moment is not about them, and that not every moment needs to be focused on one's own personal productivity. I think it's an amazing opportunity to think about what we're doing to promote the advancement of our Black colleagues, to ensure that Black students are succeeding in our classes and in the admissions process, to do some of the things that were recommended in some of the slides that Faith and I presented, like reaching out to Black mentees, to ensure that they are getting connected to other people. And also, like, on the flip side, to not see it as an opportunity. So I think one of the biggest fears is that white men will see this as an opportunity for a new area of research and of their own personal development. And I think that's definitely something we should be actively working against, is treating this as like, oh, great, I just had a new idea. Like I should study something about Black health because I now realize it's a problem. So I think that that's sort of also, the flip side of things of one of the main things that we want to be avoiding, and to make space at the table, to maybe do the opposite of self-advancement for a little while, and to try to think about the service that we can do to take some of the burden off of other people so that they have time for some of their own, self-advancement.
Yeah, Jonathon, excellent response. And just adding to that, I know with a lot of the COVID-19 grant opportunities, again, as I said earlier, there were colleagues who were very intentional in terms of reaching out to Black clinicians and Black researchers to be a part of these grant opportunities. And again, these decisions are sometimes made behind closed doors. And I think there are folks right now who are at the table who are really trying to change that culture. And again, this is an opportunity to help to elevate someone else's careers. Personally, when I'm provided with an invite, if I decline, I try to recommend another faculty of color or student of color, a PhD student who can lecture. So again, there are some amazing opportunities that people decline every day. And this one opportunity could really have a huge impact on someone's career. So again, being thoughtful and intentional about recommending other people and thinking about your positionality as you decline offers and how you can engage other people in the process.
A couple of people have been asking about how to balance, not placing the burden of self-advocacy on minorities while also ensuring that the academic experience is enhanced for these individuals, especially in situations where if Black grad students or other junior lab members might be in predominantly white institutions where they feel relatively powerless and have a fear of retaliation by senior faculty members who might not share their values.
Specifically, which aspect of that question would you, because I know we just have 2 minutes at this point, so let us know.
Yeah, so I guess how would you, I think this is more for non-Black people, how would you encourage them to make sure they're not placing the burden of advocacy on minorities while they're also being properly educated themselves and also educating their environment of the Black minority experience without kind of speaking over them and over their experiences as well?
So, I mean, I can provide maybe like a really quick example, which is that like I was on Twitter collecting some of these experiences for the slides, and I saw a white clinician who like had this ingenious idea on Twitter just a few days ago to like ask if there was some way that we might collect all of the negative experiences that Black faculty have had. And so like all of the comments were like, have you seen the Black and the Ivory, thread, because it's been happening for months. Like you didn't just have this idea. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest things that people can do is like, look at what's already there and not rely on new work from people who are already overburdened, because there isn't a lot of amazing work that's already been done and is freely available and won't continue to overburden people. It's a lot to ask people to do it in the first place, and the fact that it's been done and is recorded and exists in very easily Googleable places means that like the best way forward is to not ask for people to do it all over again, and not ask for people to have to share their own personal experiences when there's a wealth of now like personal experience that's well documented that people have already gone through the pain of sharing. And to like keep asking people to sort of inflict that pain upon themselves again, I think is probably one of the least productive things we could do. And so I would say the biggest thing would be to search for existing resources, ask non-Black friends who are interested in advocacy and allyship what they have already been working with in terms of materials and whatnot, because the stuff is out there, it exists, it's well documented. There are plenty of books, there are plenty of websites, and so I think that would be probably the single largest thing, would be to like use what already has been put out there with a lot of sort of pain and effort, rather than continuing to require additional pain and effort from people.
Agreed. Jonathon, I would like to highlight, and we talked about this in terms of Cite Black Women, and I think acknowledging knowledge production of Black people is key during this time. So in terms of, again, who you decide to elevate, who you're citing in your work, when you're talking to colleagues, it's important to know these people, know Dr. Uche Blackstock, who's writing articles about COVID-19 and health inequities and disparities and the experiences of clinician researchers in academic institutions. So This requires dismantling white supremacy, requires a whole new reconstruction, new socialization of what we were taught. It requires us to be very intentional, and we can do this. We're academics. We have to learn new things. We have to be open to things. We have to look things up. It's not always a matter of asking the Black academic, well, tell me about this. So some individual self-exploration is going to be important in this process. So yes, I agree with all those points.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much to Dr. Rendina, Dr. Fletcher, and Dr. Gulgoz for this conversation. We really appreciate it. And for the rest of the audience, I hope that you do come back for the next discussion, which will be on October 7th. And that's going to be on the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and the fight for racial justice and the implication or the impacts on racial and sexual minority communities. So we do hope that you come back for that conversation. All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.